Thank you for hanging in there while we dealt with some technical difficulties. Thank you so much to library staff for helping us figure this out. If you haven't already, please be sure to check out any snacks or drinks. That way we're not opening cans while speakers are speaking. And that's also that much less I have to put in my car at the end of the night. So please help yourself. Thank you so much for coming to our second annual Charles L. Wagandt II Memorial Lecture. We are so honored to be able to host this event and that you all came out. I have the president of Patapsco Heritage Greenways Board ready to say a little welcome. For those who don't know, Patapsco Heritage Greenway is the nonprofit management entity of the Patapsco Valley Heritage Area, which is one of Maryland's 13 certified heritage areas, which are administered by the Maryland Historical Trust and the Maryland Heritage Areas Authority. So please welcome Mark Sutherland, our president.
Handoff guy, from an awesome Kyla to our equally awesome Lisa, just to welcome you all on behalf of the Patapsco Heritage Greenway, all the information about the Wagandt family and this great set of presentations, which I guess is the second annual.
Yes.
Fine. It will continue. Right? So details will be brought by Lisa. Again, thanks for coming. It's a great turnout. Hope you enjoy it.
Thank you. My name is Lisa Jensen, and I've been a PhD board member for somewhere the range of something like 16 years or maybe 17 years. And the reason that we're here tonight is to honor, yet again, Charles L. Wagandt II. And if you were here last year, you're going to hear some repeat, because I'm assuming there are people in the audience who didn't hear how wonderful Charles is. So we're going to talk about how wonderful Charles was and the amazing number of things that he accomplished and why we're honoring him with this lecture. And then we're going to introduce Sophie. So good evening, and as many of you may be aware, Charles Wagandt, who passed in 2020, was known for his maverick and innovative ideas and his dedicated work ethic, focused primarily in Oella and the central Patapsco River area. He was an avid hiker, skier, not a lot in the Patapsco Valley, and preservationist who wished to share the Patapsco Valley's unique character and its rich and historic environmental resources with the general public. He was an extremely modest man, and few may be aware that Charles received 2 statewide and several county awards for his lifetime preservation achievements. He was a true scholar and a gentleman and a man of the highest integrity. Best known for his work in Oella, Charles purchased the mill village, but not the mill itself, not the textile mill itself. This is a rendering done after the mill was renovated, but you're supposed to look beyond that and think of a World War I era brick structure. He did not purchase the mill itself from W.J. Dickey and Sons family that had manufactured wool cloth in the whole mill village of Oella until the spring of 1972. The land that Charles purchased stretched from Lower Granite Hill, and this current view you might recognize as you leave Ellicott City and head up Oella Avenue. And it stretched near the Ellicott City Bridge, it stretched all the way up Oella Avenue to the intersection of Race Road and beyond. Whoops, we missed one, sorry, okay. Sorry, this got out of order. There, that's the one that's queued for Race Road and beyond. So this is the sign located at Race Road. Charles installed it, and if you're driving from the Catonsville side of the horseshoe-shaped road, when you see this, you know that basically everything downhill from there was touched by Charles. So with hilly topography and granite bedrock, stop on this for a minute, Kayla, no public water and sewer. I want you to notice the outhouses. So this is Spring Street. We'll see other photos later, but this is a 1930-something photograph. But here are the outhouses. This is Oella Avenue, and the river is right here. So when you use the outhouse, the effluent, you know. Okay, so these were mill workers' houses. We called them Spring Street. There were over 100 occupied and unoccupied mill worker residences, as well as associated structures such as the church and the community hall. This is the community hall on the right. There's the mill itself in the background. And many may have considered Charles a bit off his rocker. You have to understand, I say this with love, okay? A bit off his rocker in his attempt to tackle the revitalization of an entire textile mill village. This is the same Spring Street. Once the outhouses are gone, right over the edge is the river. So what is now a sidewalk and a green stretch, these houses are separated right from the river. So those are maybe 1830s-ish, something like that. So with great diplomacy and much perseverance, Charles began the task of renovating this entire mill village by cajoling the Baltimore County officials into providing public water and sewer to the community. So this is the back of something called Long Brick Row, where there are 19 brick workers' houses just north of the mill, and you can see chicken coops, pigeon coops, outhouses, and this dirt driveway. And again, right behind us to the left here is the river. So to put the 1985 arrival of the public water and sewer into context, those of you who have white or gray hair and have lived in Maryland may remember that 4 years before that date, Mayor William Donald Schaefer bathed with his rubber ducky in the National Aquarium seal tank. And Oella residents had cable TV, but not flush toilets. Think about that. In the 1980s, mid-1980s. So that's when Baltimore County provided Oella residents with public water and sewer, thanks to Charles. With that feat in his rearview mirror, Charles began restoration and historic rehab of the 106 existing houses, and he planned for new infill construction as well. His focus was preserving the character of the village as seen from Oella Avenue. He and the Oella Company supervised most of the rehabs. So this is Spring Street, that same row that you saw before. This is a pretty recent picture of it, but looks a little different, but you can see that it's very much still the same set of structures. Those are duplexes, so each mill worker family would have half. And the reason it's called Spring Street is natural springs come down the back. Charles and the Oella Company supervised most rehabs and 4 new townhouses, though some existing homes were rehabbed by others, such as Long Brick Row. We saw the back of Long Brick Row a few minutes ago. This is the front of Long Brick Row, 19 contiguous houses that were renovated. Charles also had other community agendas. He made sure that any mill worker family that wished to continue living in Oella, this is after the mill has left, during its renaissance, could do that through social services programs and his own discounted rents. When he struggled just a little bit to sell a log cabin, he made it available to the nonprofit organization Historic Ellicott City as a decorator's show house fundraiser. So that's the inside of the log cabin at the top of Logtown Road. Concurrently, Charles worked for 16 years to get the George Ellicott House, which was constructed in 1789. It was the last surviving Ellicott home in the Ellicott Mills proper, moved out of the floodplain, across Frederick Road, and set atop a basement with a raised foundation. I believe this is Bob Miller's photograph.
I think it is. Yeah.
Improperly attributed to Preservation Maryland. So I'm correcting the record, okay? Bob Miller is here. So this is a photograph of, is this one yours, Bob?
Probably is.
Probably, this one's probably Bob's too. Okay, so this is the 1789 George Ellicott House. It was located in the parking lot of what we now call the Patapsco Flour Mill, or the Donut Factory, Wilkins Rogers. It was the last surviving one of the Ellicott's houses, and in 1972, when Agnes came through, it wiped out the Jonathan Ellicott House, which was upstream, and protected this, but as soon as that was removed, then in 1975, when the next 1,000-year flood came, we're going to learn a little bit more about floods. When it came, it wiped out this entire corner, so if you see a little change in the masonry there, that was wiped out. Charles worked for many years to raise the money to get it moved across the street. So in order to do that, he assembled a dedicated individuals, rallied local organizations, worked on fundraising, applied for and received grant funds from the Maryland Historic Trust, negotiated easements, hired contractors, and when the general contractor filed for bankruptcy, even finished the historic rehab with his own forces. There's Charles in 2017 in the front steps of the George Ellicott House. Charles also worked for close to 20 years to get the state park to put in its first accessible trail, the Grist Mill Trail, from Ilchester to Avalon. This is a key piece today because it's closed. Again? Okay. But good news I heard yesterday, it might reopen by 4th of July. So one of the things they're doing is replacing the walkway that goes across here so that people who are riding bikes, pushing strollers, walking with crutches, whatever they need to do, can get across there. So that's a railroad bridge that runs alongside the Grist Mill Trail. Getting the trail approved required lobbying government agencies and local and state officials and politicians, as well as trying to win over the local Sierra Club, whose position at that time was that there should not be any paved trails within the state park at all. Okay. Charles worked for inclusivity to make our heritage and our environment available to all. So this is a bridge that takes you from the Ilchester area over into the trail. As a trustee on the board of the Maryland Historic Trust, Charles learned of grant funding opportunities, and believing the public deserved to know as much as possible about America's first black man of science, Charles pressed for archaeological work. That phrase was politically correct when he was using it. It may not be politically correct now, but it was politically correct while he was using it. Charles pressed for archaeological work to be undertaken to accurately identify the location of Benjamin Banneker's log cabin in Upper Oella, which had burned on the date of his 1806 funeral. When the first round of archaeological investigations wasn't conclusive, Charles did not rest, and he sought assistance and funding for more research. With guidance from historian John McGrain's research, the focus was narrowed, and eventually a reproduction log cabin was erected on what they believed to be the site of the original cabin. This is now part of the Benjamin Banneker Historic Park and Museum in Upper Oella. So working with the Ellicott City Restoration Foundation, are you tired yet? I'm just listening to what Charles just makes me exhausted. Working with the Ellicott City Restoration Foundation, Historic Ellicott City, and the Ellicott City Business Association, Charles helped to found what is now known as the Patapsco Heritage Greenway. Then it was a collaborative, nonprofit organization dedicated to preservation, recreation, and sustainable environmental and economic development. He led the effort with an initial grant used to document oral histories by recording the memories and the photos of Patapsco mill workers and the residents. We have a book in the back which is sort of an offshoot of those original histories. Justine is holding a copy up. If anybody wants to have that as a tabletop book, go for it. He wanted to make sure that older Oella residents had their memories captured on tape and in photographs as long as possible while they could still tell their own stories. The body of that work and Charles's massive collection of Oella history, artifacts, and memorabilia have been archived and moved under the curatorship of UMBC. Many years before that, also through Charles's efforts, due to their significance, some of the W.J. Dickey and Sons, remember those are the textile mill owner family, some of their textile mill artifacts were acquired by the Smithsonian for safekeeping because they were really important in the history of industry. Charles was the first person I ever heard mention a vision, his vision, for a Patapsco Valley heritage area. And frankly, it never would have been created without his vision and his perseverance. Among his other projects, I'm starting to tear up, I apologize. Charles lobbied for and applied for grant funding to inventory the historic industrial sites along the Patapsco from Elkridge to Route 40. And this is, in case anybody tell me what it is? It's a dam, but which dam? It's the Oella Mill Dam. Right? Oh, sorry. Oh, cheating. Okay. I couldn't see it from here. All right. Okay. So this was the dam that took the water off right near the Route 40 bridge and channeled it along a 1.75 mile raceway to bring it to what we now call the Oella Mill, which was W.J. Dickey and Sons Mill, to provide the power to run, prior to that Union Manufacturing Company, to provide the power to run the textile machinery that was necessary. So Charles then helped researcher Henry K. Sharp turn the information that he acquired in this inventory into a book to educate the public on the Patapsco River Valley's rich industrial history that formed the nucleus of our heritage area. Due to some local opposition, the application for the creation of the heritage area was delayed by many years, finally coming to fruition in 2015. As the 13th heritage area in Maryland, ours boasts the only dual focus, preservation of heritage as well as natural resources. And I will now stop talking because the natural resources leads me to natural resources. There we go. Okay. Natural resources leads me to introduce our guest speaker this evening, Sophie Hess, who will share some of her findings about the historic flooding in the Patapsco Valley. Sophie is originally from the Baltimore area, and she got her undergraduate degree in history from Oberlin College in Ohio. After college, Sophie returned to Maryland and worked at a women's shelter. It's a little jumping going on here. In Baltimore, which is called House of Ruth. If anyone's been around Baltimore, you know what that is. She considered a career in social work, but ultimately decided to go back to school to pursue a PhD in history. Currently, her dissertation research focuses on the natural resource extraction and cultural ecology in Maryland's Patapsco River Valley. Her work has been supported by the McNeil Center for History and Culture, which we all know is the Maryland Historical Society name, the Library Company of Philadelphia, the McNeil Center for Early American Studies. We are honored to have such a promising scholar share her work with us here tonight, and so without further ado, I would like to introduce Sophie Hess, our featured speaker.
Hey. So thank you so much for having me here tonight. This is really such an honor, and I want to particularly thank Kyla Pools, Erin Shapiro, and Lisa Jensen for inviting me to speak today. I'll say that I'm a frequent visitor to PHG's YouTube page. I'm a really big fan of all the talks that the organization gives. The scholars and community speakers that have been hosted here over the past few years really challenge me and inform my own work. So I feel like I have some tough acts to follow, and thank you all for coming out to be a part of this conversation. I just want to preface my talk by saying I'm really trained as a historian of colonial and 19th century America, and I'm writing close to finishing a dissertation that is an environmental history of industrialization and ecology in the Patapsco River Valley. So this talk will begin prior to Euro-American settlement and end shortly after the Civil War with the flood of 1868. I'll talk a little bit about historical memory in the modern era too. What I won't talk about tonight very much is 20th century floods like Hurricane Agnes or the most recent storms in 2016 or 2018. These events certainly inform my narrative in ways that I think that you'll pick up on, but when I was preparing this presentation, I really wanted to focus on the early period because I think the relationship that it has to floods and natural disasters has been underexplored. Also, particularly because we're gathering here in the Patapsco River Valley, you all may have expertise in history in places where I have gaps. And so I'm very open to further conversation, questions, and opportunities to collaborate. I'll leave my email at the end, and I'm sure we can talk as well afterwards. So should I say next slide? Yes. Okay, so next slide. Historians tend to investigate questions about how things were different in the past, how life changed over time, and how the past informs the present. As an environmental historian, I'm particularly interested in these questions as they pertain to ecology. How did the natural world look different in the past? How have humans changed it? And how do humans relate to the environment and other living things? Ecologists ask similar questions, but they use quantitative means of analysis like collecting water and soil samples. I'm trained to use archival sources created by humans. I look at old letters, newspapers, receipts, maps, and other things, some of which I'll talk about here today. This is really the bread and butter of what I do, but before I dig in, I want to lay out a little bit of groundwork about flooding. Next slide, please. So this is two images of a river floodplain. What these two images show us is that rivers have wider floodplains than might appear to be true on any given day. The image to the left is a river floodplain with essentially natural ecology built up around it. The areas to the side of the rivers are wetlands, which occasionally flood and grow wetter and drier at different points of the year. Not only is this normal, it's healthy for the river. Many of you may know, for instance, that every spring the banks of the Patapsco River have vernal springs, tiny ephemeral pools, which pop up in the water when the ground begins to melt, provide predator-free habitats for frogs and salamanders to lay their eggs. By summer, the pools are gone, and there is a great talk about this on PhD's YouTube page. So you might check it out. Wetlands are built to accommodate and absorb floods as well as runoff from land. You also see that in this first illustration, there are lots of trees and plants that absorb excess water and help mitigate sudden rain or snowmelt. The second illustration suggests the ways that human interventions affect a river's flow. Here, the wetlands have been converted into farmland and an artificial levee or buffer is created here, which is supposed to shield the area from flooding. Oops, excuse me. The river has also been straightened or channelized so that instead of meandering, it flows in a sort of more predictable manner. That thick tree growth, which you see on the left side, has also been cut down. So when the river to the right floods, there's less space for the water to go. And when it runs out over its boundaries, it causes what we think of as a disaster, destroying crops and causing all kinds of damage that I think many of us are familiar with. Next slide. So one kind of complex thing that I want to set up here at the beginning is that it is normal for rivers to flood. It is part of what they naturally do, but we also manipulate them in ways that make floods worse. So this image shows some of the ways we manipulate rivers. You see water mills at the top, different types of residential and commercial settlement, irrigation, deforestation, bridge building, dredging and dumping. Most of these things are things that have at one point or another been done along the Patapsco. But a lot of these things are also beneficial for our society. For instance, we didn't have bridges, we wouldn't be able to get from one place to another. So when a river floods, sometimes it's a moment when nature's needs are simply in conflict with society's. Next slide, please. So we also have this concept of a disaster, which is something that environmental historians are really interested in understanding throughout history. You may have heard the saying, there's no such thing as a natural disaster, maybe? This is a sort of slogan that disaster workers talk about, and it means when there's an extreme climatic event, like a hurricane, a flood, a blizzard, a tsunami, it's not simply an act of God, but also a failure of the built environment that causes damage. So this idea of natural disaster changes over time throughout history, and it reflects different values and anxieties that people have about what's going on in the world. This is an image of a massive flood in 1815 Rhode Island, and this was circulated throughout the Atlantic world. I'll talk later about the media and the ways that it can help sort of conceptualize and represent disasters. Next slide. So finally, I just want to reference some works of environmental history briefly that have been helpful for me. I work in the micro-historical mode, and these books do too. They sort of follow one river across one disaster or one storm over a period of time. Andy Horowitz's Hurricane Katrina, for instance, looks at the history of storms in Louisiana in the 20th century. So the main overarching questions that I ask in my work is why does this river, the Patapsco, keep flooding? Why did floods get worse? And how do people who live along the river throughout history experience and influence these changes? Next slide. With these ideas in mind, I want to turn now and situate us to the Patapsco River Valley prior to settlement by Europeans. For thousands of years before settlement by English colonists, the area was the ancestral homeland of indigenous people, particularly the Susquehannock and Piscataway confederacies, as well as other small polities. One of the interesting claims that archaeologists and other scholars have made is that it's likely the Patapsco had no permanent indigenous settlement for most of the time before Europeans came. Rather, it was primarily used as hunting and fishing ground. Next slide. So you may be familiar with this map. This is John Smith's map from 1608, which provides one of our earliest European cartographic depictions of the region. Smith's map was circulated to the English elite as an advertisement of sorts, showing the abundance of natural resources. So the Chesapeake Bay cuts through the middle. It's oriented horizontally instead of vertically. And the Patapsco River, I'll zoom in more, but it's sort of in the middle up there. So you can see, next slide, pretty clearly that Smith and his cartographers have written the names of a bunch of different indigenous settlements, which they encountered along the Chesapeake. Most of these names are Nanticoke, which is an Algonquin language spoken by a lot of different groups throughout southern Maryland, including Piscataway people. You can see Accomack, for instance, somewhere in the middle, can't quite reach, but right here. And then there's also Patapsco right there. Now, that's not the Patapsco River, that's right here. The Patapsco River was originally called the Bullis River because when John Smith came, he saw deposits of iron ore, which they called red bulls. So this is the Patapsco River. So pretty much all of the names here are indigenous. And something that I think is really interesting is that most of these towns and settlements were based along rivers. Many Native scholars and activists in the present day talk about the centrality of water to indigenous sovereignty. Many indigenous cosmologies conceptualize that bodies of water, as well as plants and animals, are non-human relations in the same way that people relate to a tribe. So in other words, water is family. Water is something that you would care for and protect in the same way that you would your family. Next slide. But the Patapsco River, the Bullis River, doesn't have any indigenous settlements along it. And this is something that I found sort of interesting about this map, and I found was actually true for other maps too. Next slide, please. So this is another map, Edward White's Relation of Maryland, and you see here too in the red, that's the Patapsco River, and while there are these sort of indigenous settlements that kind of wind along the Patuxent and the Potomac, the Patapsco River is sort of empty. So when I started to see this absence in different records, I thought at first it was something that colonists had done as a way of claiming land. By not acknowledging these settlements, they were able to basically say, no one's here, I can do whatever I want with it. And that's something that historians talk about a lot throughout history. But these maps also combine with an archaeological record that also says people lived here only for 20 to 30 years at a time. This is something that Catherine Sterner talked about recently at her Patapsco Days talk. So, next slide, please. So most archaeologists think that Piscataway people lived further down here and Susquehannock people lived further up to the top. The Patapsco is one of these rivers that runs in the middle, which is sort of this like borderland space. So all of this research sort of made me think that this was really strange. I didn't really understand why no one lived here. And then I was talking to a colleague and she said to me, well, do you think that maybe people didn't live here permanently because they were aware that the river flooded all the time? So this idea has really guided my inquiry ever since. I've stopped trying to find concrete evidence that these people called this place a sedentary home in the same way that colonists would come to. Instead, I began to consider how they might have perceived this river as part of a much broader geography of home and stewarded it in ways which might have included not building permanent settlements. In other words, they lived further away from it so that they could allow it to behave as it naturally would. Next slide. We know that in the spring, Piscataway and Susquehannock people came to this river to hunt migratory fish, which traveled upstream from the Chesapeake Bay into freshwater streams to spawn. These included shad, herring, striped bass, sea lamprey, and American eel. These fish are important foods that these people would gather during the spring and then smoke or cure to eat throughout the year. We also know that they ate them because they show up in refuse pits in southern Maryland, where Piscataway people still do live today. So the early indigenous people who moved within the geography of the Patapsco related to it with an understanding that the river needed to be healthy as a migratory habitat for these fish and other animals. This river can and does grow very wide, and this is one of the features which makes it powerful and remarkable and also dangerous and worthy of special care. Next slide. So now we're going to shift focus a bit to the time of Euro-American settlement. As I alluded to in the previous section, the Patapsco was of immediate interest to English settlers. The region was settled in 1690 by a few tobacco planters. It appealed as a site of transportation, and we know that Elkridge was used as a port back then. It was wide enough and deep enough to accommodate seafaring ships, which is pretty incredible, I think. By the early 18th century, iron proprietors had also started to harness the power of the river to process iron. Next slide. In the late 18th century, the Ellicott family arrived, establishing industrial technology for flour production. And Henry Sharp's work does an amazing job of explaining this process of industrialization in more detail. He convincingly argues that these innovations made Ellicott's Mills America's first hub of industrialization before Lowell's Mills in Massachusetts. The important thing to understand is also that Ellicott mills were not neighborhood grist mills. They were large commercial enterprises that were meant to create a new system of economy for the valley. Next slide. When the Ellicott family moved to the region, they also brought with them a vibrant culture of recorded words. The Ellicotts were Quakers, and so they were particularly literate during this period, and they kept records of their activities through diaries, letters, and account books. One text that I found to be extremely useful is John Tyson's 1810 History of Ellicott's Mills, which was transcribed and kept by the Tyson family, including Martha Ellicott Tyson. Many of you may be familiar with her. And this is an image from Swarthmore College where these records are kept, and if you look at the top, you can see the cutoff of a full-size figurine of her body that they keep in the library. So John Tyson's records are pretty exciting because they give a lot of detail about the ecology in the valley and also talk in detail about specific floods that he experienced. Next slide. The early floods that he experienced were called freshets. They were rushes of water which occurred in spring when a buildup of snow during the winter was followed by a sharp increase in temperature in early spring. Tyson described these freshets as terrifying, and one that he talks about in 1780 really stuck out to me. He said the thermometer suddenly rose almost to the point of summer heat. Heavy rains came. It seemed as though the waters above were calling to the waters below to unite in one widespread and destructive deluge in a war of the elements upon man. The residents of the village at the time fled for higher ground. They left behind their fields, their mills, and their livestock. And while no one died that day, the flood swept up many horses, cows, sheep, hogs, and poultry, who drowned in what Tyson calls, quote, the combined torrent of flood and ice. In the 18th century, freshets were actually the most common form of violent flooding in the Chesapeake, and ecologists think that this was because early settlement in the region eviscerated the old-growth hickory and oak forests, which had served to shelter river ecosystems from violent storms. There are also recorded freshets throughout the Chesapeake in 1738, 1752, and 1771. Next slide. By the end of the 18th century, the valley had become a hub of industrial production. So all the circles are mills, and all of the squares are forages. And you can see how many of them by 1794 have sort of come up in the Patapsco. So one of the major things that happens is deforestation, which is needed to power these different operations. There's also a lot of silt buildup in the environment, and I can talk more about the different effects, but I want to be a little bit mindful of time. So next slide. I want to return to this image which we were just looking at, which depicts Ellicott's Upper Mills, built in 1775, the first mill in the region. The race is right here, I believe. And the dam, and damming was another huge thing that these mills really did. The dam is right here. So keep this image in your mind, and then next slide. Okay, so this is an image from 1854, years after the structure had been ravaged by a flood. You can see the building has been essentially abandoned, and it seems to be sinking into the river. There's a dead tree in front too, which in the sort of romantic visual rhetoric of the period, and also just obviously signifies death. It's a striking image. Next slide. And what's I think really interesting about this image is it's placed in the top corner of this view by Edward Soxie that otherwise shows total prosperity and beauty in this town. And I think that the reason that they chose to include this is because by this period there had already been a lot of evidence in newspapers that the area was flooding. Next slide. So these are two floods, one from 1837, one from 1847, and you can see they're not from Maryland. One is from Hartford, Connecticut, and one is from New York. And the first one talks about the effects mostly in Baltimore, but they sort of allude to things that are happening along the Patapsco further north as well. And they talk about the small streams that led up to the Patapsco. They say that hundreds of families were affected by this flood. The one from 1847 specifically mentions the mills at Granite and Milchester around here, which were destroyed. So that these floods appear in national presses so early suggests that the area was becoming known for these type of episodes. Also at this time, the B&O Railroad had begun to run through the valley, and so the river had become a landmark. As passenger trains passed through, a traveler could look down out of their window and see the river, which was beautiful and just lovely to look at, but they also knew in the back of their mind that this river could be really dangerous as well. So it was very memorable for that reason. Next slide. So for a long time, most of the information that I had about floods during this period came from newspapers and other public records. Accounts like John Tyson's require a fair amount of digging and luck. And recently I had another lucky find which came through Charles Wagandt's archives, which were donated by his family to UMBC's Alvin O'Kuhn Special Collections. I believe these records were donated in 2021, is that? And I've only begun working with them this spring. I've been working on this project since 2017, so for me this was like a new treasure trove of information. And I want to say that this is really a true gift to make a collection like this available for the public. I think it reflects the care of families who assemble these records over the course of their lives, and it also reflects a trust in archivists and researchers to use these materials and sources well. So I'm very moved by the fact that these records ended up in a public place. So it's 75 linear feet, 83 boxes. It's a ton of material. And I've only started to kind of scratch the surface of it. Every box is like incredibly rich, and I could probably spend, 10 years writing a book just about this collection. But one thing that I found that's really exciting I'm going to tell you about now. So next slide, please. And I'll say too that anyone can go visit these. You just have to make an appointment at UMBC and go down the road. So the archivists at UMBC have begun to process this collection and make it available through finding aids. If there are any archivists in the room, I apologize for sort of butchering the process. But basically, they give it a number, O, A, and then sort of each collection has a specific little sub-number 46, so OA 46. And this is the Isaac Taylor McComas Journal. So this source really jumped out at me as I was looking through the records because journals for historians are sort of like the caviar of primary sources. We always fantasize about them, but not that many of them really exist. It's very rare to have a truly first-hand account of everything, and we end up looking at receipts and account books and all sorts of things that really don't tell the story in a person's words. But there's this journal here called the Isaac Taylor McComas Journal, and the amazing thing about it is it was transcribed. Old records tend to be written by people with not the best handwriting, so it's very exciting to have not only a journal, but one that I could read relatively quickly and closely. It was transcribed by a man named C.W. Robb, and I think that was a family member of McComas's. So Isaac Taylor McComas was a small mill owner in the Patapsco River Valley. He wrote this journal from 1854 to 1924. Kind of incredible. I think he lived even longer. It's a very long life for that period. So next slide. So what I'm beginning to find from using this journal is that he offers a more granular experience of how it felt to live along the river and to try and profit from it in the years close to what we think of as the Great Flood in 1868. So this is just a 2-year stretch. In 1867, he talks about the water raised quite high in the mill. That's a flood. October 29th, our raised banks broke again last night and washed out a carload of bone meal. And then July 24th, 1868 is the date of the Great Flood. And he definitely focuses on how bad this is. He says, we've had one of the greatest floods here, and all along the line of the railroad, everything that was there was destroyed. I think I paraphrased a little bit. It has almost ruined us. It has taken away all the bone, plaster, and sawmills, et cetera, et cetera. But for many days afterwards, he talks about how horrible it is and how much he's trying to rebuild. And then there's this interesting entry on August 21st, where he says, we're actually doing pretty well. We're getting a lot of wheat because the Ellicott's mills was washed away. So for him, 1868 was maybe not the worst thing ever. But then there's this flood about a year later that he mentions almost like kind of in an offhanded way. He says, we had an awful night last night. I was up all night. I came in, the house flooded everything. Just a month after that, he notes that he goes to Baltimore to get to California. And he spends the next 10 years living in California. So which flood it was that sort of tipped him over the edge, I'm not sure, but yeah. Next slide. Okay, so we're kind of brushing up into the 1868 flood, and I want to talk about this one specifically because I think we all know it's a little bit different. And one of the things that I think is really different is how much it gets picked up in the presses. This flood was talked about in New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Iowa, Galveston, Texas, and New Orleans. The Baltimore Sun fixates on it for months and months and months. You can't open up the Baltimore Sun without seeing information about this flood. Next slide. So this is a full-page spread in the New York Herald. Everything on this page is about the flood. The title image here, the deluge, sort of goes into some of the key details that you might want to talk or might want to go into if you read this. And I think one thing that's interesting is the idea that the 1837 flood was eclipsed, so people already know that these floods have been bad. They talk about Ellicott City in a little bit more detail here too. Next slide. And then many of you are probably familiar too with these Harper's Weekly images, and these ran pretty much throughout the country. I'm not exactly sure what their readership was, but it was pretty extensive. And I think the visual depictions of these floods are really important. They're almost biblical in nature. They really kind of get this sense of what kind of things are being lost in this flood. It centers women and children. It centers domestic objects that are being washed away, and it really kind of makes it seem larger than life. And I think it was larger than life. I'll also say I extensively researched the 1868 flood, and I am happy to talk about it much more, but I didn't want to fixate on it too much today because part of what I wanted to talk about was that it's not just 1868, but if you have questions about it, I definitely am happy to talk about it more. Next slide. So one of the things that I think is important about it is that the 1868 flood established this visual rhetoric of what destruction and recovery look like. The disaster came years before these other super destructive floods that happened nationally, like the Mill River disaster in 1874, which is in Massachusetts. That kills 139 people. And the Johnstown flood in 1889 kills a staggering 2,208. That's in Pennsylvania. This flood kills somewhere between 30 and 60 people, which is a lot for any time, and for that time it was particularly significant. So the images that are circulated in Ellicott's Mills disaster really set a blueprint media-wise for future disasters. Next slide. This is a stereoscope, and technology like photography and stereoscope had really boomed during the Civil War. We think of the Civil War as really the advent of modern photography. So this is an image that actually comes from the Massachusetts Digital Commonwealth Repository, which means that it was circulated to Massachusetts. If you see at the bottom, it says Patapsco Valley Effects of the Great Flood of 1868. So this is something that would be sold and people could look at if they were in Massachusetts and sort of visualize the destruction. Next slide. And then these are images that are from the Mill River disaster in 1874, which is 6 years later. You can see that the same sort of marketing and visuality, I guess you might say, is used here. It says, gives the name of the flood and sort of talks a little bit about, or sort of visualizes what happens. There are also these people swimming right here. Next slide. And then this is the Johnstown flood of 1889. And this is really just like a staggering flood. But also this image is staged, and I think it's really clear here that they're putting forth an idea that this community will rebuild. And I think that there's really connections between this flood and the Ellicott City flood and the ways that they're sort of represented in national media, even though this one is at the time so huge. Next. Okay, no. So one point that I do want to make sure that we come away with from today is that the Ellicott City flood was not important only to Ellicott City, but also to America. It gave a blueprint for modern disaster. And in history, we talk a lot about modernity and why the end of the 19th century affected all these rapid cultural changes. Communications technology had advanced so much, and it sort of creates this perfect storm when you have all this modern communication with the reality that years of industrialization and urbanization had made flooding disasters markedly more destructive and fatal by the end of the 19th century. So the 1868 storm is really a turning point, but it's also part of a much longer and more complex history of life along a powerful and dangerous river. Next slide. So in closing, I want to offer a few brief reflections on what this early history does in a community which, as we know, struggles and continues to struggle with threats and realities of flooding today. Next slide. Since 1868, there's been a lot of deindustrialization in the valley, which has given the river back some of its wetland and forest buffer. Community members have led these efforts, and organizations like the Patapsco Valley State Park and more recently the Patapsco Heritage Greenway have done amazing work to both restore some of these ecosystems and educate the public about their role in being good stewards of the river. I'm very inspired by the deep relationships that people in the valley have had to this river and its ecology throughout time here. Next slide. But as we know, these floods have continued throughout the 20th and 21st century, and many of them have been incredibly devastating. These floods also raise questions about the role of the valley's early history in shaping its future. So here you see Charles Wagandt's famous campaign to move the George Ellicott House out of a dangerous floodplain onto higher ground. a move that was pretty groundbreaking when it was carried out in the 1980s, especially preservation technology-wise. It's amazing that because of this effort, we'll be able to preserve and engage with this 18th century building, which holds an important part of the valley's history for generations to come. I also wonder about the ways that these acts of preservation might also help us connect the dots between experiences of flooding in the past and present. When we think of George Ellicott, we might think of a businessman, a man of science, an abolitionist, but he also lived in a floodplain and also navigated questions about how to deal with its threats. I believe it's really important to situate historical figures in their environments and to better understand the choices that they made and how these choices relate to choices in our present. Next slide. Finally, the valley has also many other sites of industrial ruin which offer stories which are only just emerging about its history. So these are the ruins of the Elkridge Furnace, which are found behind the Elkridge Furnace Inn. This furnace faced floods and fire throughout its operations, and it changed hands many times, and it finally ceased to operate sometime in the mid-19th century. Today, the ruins lie mostly untouched, brushing up against the banks of the Patapsco River, sinking into the ground, as you can see here. The furnace operated on the exploitation of enslaved and convict laborers, many of whom used the river as a site through which to escape bondage. Because of these acts, a couple of years ago, I worked with the Patapsco Valley State Park to have this site registered as part of the National Park Service Underground Railroad Network to Freedom, a program which highlights public sites where people fought for freedom from slavery. Since this site got its award, though, I've wondered about the experiences that enslaved and convict laborers might have had with the river and the ways that it might have challenged or aided them. Could the river have threatened the furnace in ways that might have provided opportunities for the people who are seeking to flee its brutal conditions? Furthermore, where does this furnace fit into the valley's history of resource extraction, and how did the desire to profit from land and water affect the river's behavior over time? So history is an essential tool for grounding our present in the challenges of the past and to understand how we got to where we are. I hope that in tonight's talk I've offered you some insights into the ways that the past residents of the valley experienced and responded to its unique and powerful environment in its not so distant past, and the ways that these histories might help inform us about the environmental struggles of the present and the future. Next slide. So, special thanks to the archivists, historians, park rangers, and staff at these sites where I've been really grateful to conduct research. And last slide is my email where you can find me if you have more questions. Thank you so much.
Joining us this evening, and we hope you've learned as much as we have. This has been the second annual Charles L. Wagandt II Memorial Lecture, and we intend to carry on this tradition in the future. If you'd be interested in supporting the public education reflective of Charles Wagandt's initiatives in preservation, archaeology, recreational, environmental sustainability, and valley accessibility, are you tired yet? We encourage you to donate generously to Patapsco Heritage Greenway's Charles L. Wagandt Memorial Fund, and you can do that by writing a check, or you can go to the website and do it by credit card. Tonight we're selling some books, including one of the books by Dr. Henry K. Sharp, who was the one who inventoried the industrial structures up and down. That's Charles in 2018 when we were ribbon cutting a sign discussing the history of Oella right across from the Trolley Stop restaurant there. So one of the books we're selling is one by Henry K. Sharp. Charles found Hal, his nickname, Henry K. Sharp's early research, which was investigating the industrial heritage of the Patapsco River Valley, to be so compelling that he spearheaded the publication of both his first work and his second work. Patapsco Heritage Greenway sponsored several author events to share this important body of work with the public. Kyla, can you switch?
This is the last.
That's, I was trying to shorten the talk and I took out the slide. Do you see the slide of Charles talking to Henry K. Sharp? I'm happy to report that that book sold out, and Hal went on to undertake PhD research, unlike what Sophie's doing right now, focusing his dissertation on comparing Ellicott Mills to the generally more recognized factory towns of New England. Sophie referenced this before. Dr. Sharp basically proved that the early nuggets of the American Industrial Revolution indeed took place here in our valley and not exclusively in New England as had been previously accepted. Charles then pressed for years to facilitate the printing of Dr. Sharp's second book, which is America's First Factory Town. We have that one for sale in the back. This book is available from here or directly through PHG. So again, we thank you. We hope you'll come back. We hope you'll spread the word. And if you want to tell your friends who weren't able to come tonight, we will be putting this up on Patapsco Heritage Greenway's website so that you can watch it again or get your friends to watch it.
Can I just share that Ms. Hess will be speaking at the Howard County Historical Society next Friday at noon at our lunch date with history, and she will be focusing on the Great Flood of 1868.
Yeah, you in the back hear that?
No.
Loud enough? Okay.
Yep. So yeah, if you want to hear more about 1868, I'll be here next week.
And if you want to come help on June 3rd, at the upper end of Oella, the Oella Cemetery is located there, and a group of us have been working to try to find probably a nonprofit owner to take over the responsibility from W.J. Dickey and Sons trustees to maintain and care for that cemetery. So some of us have been working for years, some of us have just started recently, but we're having our second spring cleanup on the morning of Saturday, June 3rd. We'd love to have people come out and help. I'd love to see you then. Thank you all. Feel free to ask us.
We have some time left for questions. We have the room until about 8:30, so if you have questions, feel free.
I noticed on a couple of your slides, the newspapers refer to the Great Flood or the Great Storm, but it just didn't apply to 1868. It was also 1874. So what was the definition of the Great Flood?
That's such a good question, and I don't know. I think if I had to guess, I would say they probably kept calling it the Great Flood, and it kept getting worse and worse. There's this really good book by Ted Steinberg that talks about how floods really, in 1868, 30 people dying in a flood was really unheard of. They really got a lot worse in that late 19th century period. So if a flood had 7 people die, that was sort of the Great Flood too. But yeah, I think you're right.
Sophie, I'm saying it's the same thing as the Great War.
Yeah,
Okay,
that's
so
a great way
when
of.
subsequent ones eclipse it.
It becomes
the
Great War.
Yeah. Like, no, it
Exactly.
ceases to become
Oh.
what anybody else considers the Great War, but at the time was considered that. So it's always in context.
Yep, that's it. So yeah,
But
maybe.
you're still calling 1868
Well, no, you
as
don't
Great Flood.
rename it. You
And
don't
the
rename
reason
it.
that-
It's what it exists as in history.
yeah, okay.
and else.
The reason I call it the Great Flood is because that's still in our historical memory today, what it's called. There hasn't been another flood after that. If we don't call the 2015 flood the Great Flood, we call it something different. So yeah.
So you started talking about the Indians, and you said they didn't stay in the valley, and I thought you were going to describe that a little bit more. In your research, did you find out that they didn't stay in the valley?
So what we've found, and there are two, I'm not an archaeologist, and that's really the best place to go for this kind of research. Patapsco Heritage Greenway has 2 really good talks by archaeologists who go into what's been found in the region. There's a lot of different types of materials, but pottery suggests that there were settlements that were here for maybe 20 to 30 years at a time, kind of typical, but archaeologists don't think that people lived here permanently, basically. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. The reason I asked is because somebody showed me an Indian cave, and then the second one they wouldn't show me.
Sure.
And I didn't know if it was seasonal, if they just were there with the shad population around.
It certainly might have been seasonal, and there's a lot, Indigenous history is something where there are so many gaps because so many records were destroyed, so it's not to say it's not true. It might have been a place that people use. It's a good question. Any other questions?
Keep watching our event calendar. Come back and join us for other events. We'd love to have you. If you have suggestions on ones you'd like to see, please share that with us as well. If you know anybody cool like Sophie, who can do the next talk of us, so please, thank you. We're welcome and please take snacks.
Thank you. Yes, please.